So Mark asked me to come and tell or talk a little bit about maybe a future opportunity that has to do with working lands for wildlife. But first I want to share, well, what is it? Many of you may not be familiar with what working lands for wildlife is. Is it a program? What is it? And I don't even know what it is yet. I'm in the process of developing a strategic plan for what this monstrosity is, because it's not really a program. We do have some money that we're putting on the ground. It's more of a partnership. To me, it's the definition of a partnership, where we've got the Fish and Wildlife Service, who's a big partner. We've got state agencies that are huge partners in each of their respective locations. We've got the Forest Service, the BLM, and not to mention the 20 or 30 different nonprofits that are at the table with us for this thing. So I want to give a little background on how it started. It was fairly quick rollout. There was some decisions made by our chief that we wanted to move in a direction that was different than anything else that NRCS has done. They call it a paradigm shift. I don't quite know what the paradigm shift is, but it's a paradigm shift, different than what we've done before. And they targeted 7, now 8, I'll share the 8th one with you in a minute, 7 species. And there was a lot of questions about how those species were selected. You know, as biologists, we would have loved to see some on-the-ground work and involve the states to figure out what species do we need to target. And there was some of that. Gopher tortoise. There was a large partnership already in place for the gopher tortoise and the longleaf pine. There were some other partnerships with the sage-grouse initiative and lesser prairie chicken. But some of the other species, we're still kind of scratching our head. How did we end up with that one? Because it just doesn't quite fit with working lands for wildlife and how we make a win-win for agriculture and a win-win for wildlife. So we're struggling with some of that. Some of the decisions were political. That's part of the game. But the 7 species, the 8th one is the black-footed ferret. Why is an agriculture agency getting involved with one of the most contentious species that we have in the West? Well, I don't have an answer for you. But there's an opportunity with specifically the gopher tortoise and the prairie chicken where I think there's a good opportunity for us to partner more with the Bobwhite community to see what we can do to shift the meter in the right direction. So there's a list of different criteria that were used to select the species. And in my strategic plan that we're working on, the chief has it in front of him, I've got in there that any future species we add, whether it's a secondary species, which we'll talk about in a minute, or an additional primary species, that the research needs to be in place before we start in order to transfer the data from a practice that we put on the ground, acres of habitat, to a population response. Now, what level that will be, I'll share an example. With sage-grouse, we had some monitoring efforts that revealed that there were a lot of collisions with fences. And by simply marking the top strand of a fence with a little white flag, we could reduce some of those bird strikes, those collisions, those mortalities that were caused by that. So now instead of reporting miles of fence marked, we report miles of fence marked that saved 300 sage-grouse because they were marked. Well, OMB, Office of Management and Budget, loves that. So if we want to keep getting money for this partnership and put money on the ground for these species, we've got to be able to report to them those sorts of outcomes. Now, how do we do that? We don't know how we're going to do that with the gopher tortoise because it takes them 12 years to get sexually mature, so we don't even know if we're having an effect on the population. How do we do that with the sage-grouse, where there's some species that are fixing to be listed on the endangered species list, and others that are still not? You know, we're not sure how all that's going to fit together. But I've got a couple things that I think we can have some discussion about. That's why I'm down here on the floor and not up here. I want some discussion when we get to some points. And specifically, we talk about a letter that the NBCI wrote back to NRCS with some opportunities for partnership. So we talked a little bit about the strategic plan. I want to show you a critical piece that NRCS has not had, and it's some way to track our voluntary conservation. We can track our projects if we pay for it. Not a problem. If we use longleaf pine dollars to put habitat on the ground, we can keep track of it. What we can't keep track of is all the work that's done without us paying for it. So when we write conservation plans, many of you out here have worked with NRCS offices to write those plans. never goes to funding because the landowner doesn't want money. Maybe he doesn't want a contract with the government, many different reasons. We have no way to track that. So there's a large pot of acreage that we're not able to capture when we report to the Fish and Wildlife Service or report back to the state agencies what we've done for wildlife. We're missing the boat on a lot of that. So in return, a lot of the states have had to develop their own database to track our work. Well, why can't we do that? So we've got in front of our IT a little box that we're going to build into Toolkit that allows us to tag a plan with an identified priority. You name the priority. We can have a state priority. If your state has a quail initiative, we can tag a contract. We can tag a plan with that particular Bobwhite initiative. So we can start to track that acreage a little bit better. Why do I mention this? Why do you care about that? Monitoring. We are not very good at going back out after the practice is put on the ground to monitor the effectiveness of the work that we pay for, that your public dollars pay for. We recognize that. We're not sure how we're going to solve that for all of our practices, but we've got a system in place where we're going to go out every 5 years. If it's part of Working Lands for Wildlife, we're going to go out every 5 years and have someone put their feet on that site and see what the effectiveness is. We're not sure in the future how we're going to fund all the positions that are going to be doing that. We've got a good plan for the next 3 to 5 years because of all the partnerships that are in place. Long-term funding, we're not sure yet. But we're moving forward in the right direction, and we will be able to track every 5 years. And in addition, we've got a system that we're putting in place that allows a landowner to report back to us every year that they are still managing the habitat. So it's a start. It's not the Cadillac version. Call it the Chevy version. The train's moving down the right track. So, can you bring up that PDF for me? So what does that have to do with the NBCI? So y'all wrote a letter to our national biologist, the technical committee, responding to a request that our chief gave to you for how you saw how we could partner together with Working Lands for Wildlife. And here's the letter that you wrote back. There's a few spots that I wanted to have some discussion on because I'm not sure how we want to move forward with this. Scroll down to the first highlighted section. There was a statement that says the second-tier species could benefit from Working Lands for Wildlife through additional conservation practices or modifying conservation measures within existing practices after the needs of the target species are met. So what we're thinking is we obviously have our 8 identified priority species. Because this is primarily a partnership with the Fish and Wildlife Service, there's not a real interest with them to make quail a priority species. So what can we do? Well, the idea of a secondary or an indicator species that may have a quicker response. If we can use quail to indicate a response in the gopher tortoise area, similar habitat types, if we can use that as the indicator to report back to OMB that we're doing good things on the ground, then perhaps we can keep the funding coming for the gopher tortoise for longer. So we like that idea. How can we use quail as that secondary or indicator species? The other concept I want to present to you is a marketing idea. If we're marketing gopher tortoise to some landowners, they may like it. Other landowners, they don't care about the gopher tortoise, but they do care about quail. So you've got a little bit more recognition as a species that's got the hunting history that people care about, and we can use that in our marketing efforts. So the reason I highlighted this section is because of this statement right here. It sounded like y'all were thinking we could add additional conservation measures or additional practices, and I'm not sure that that's going to work. We will have to have some further discussion about how that will look on the ground, because we have conference opinions with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for all of the 8 species. And if it's not in the conference opinion, we can't spend Working Lands for Wildlife dollars on it. Well, we're not jumping at the opportunity to reopen those conference opinions. It took too long to get them developed, and if we reopen them, the cat's out of the bag. They may change some other things that we may not want to change. So I don't know if that's going to be an opportunity, just to be honest with you. If we can be kind of upfront here, I don't know if we're going to be able to add additional conservation practices. So what we can do is look at the practices that were already in there, and for the gopher tortoise, the core practices that you need for quail habitat, they're already there. Prescribed burning, planting native grasses, they're there. So we won't have to necessarily add anything. We can just start reporting those as, yeah, they benefit gopher tortoise, but they also benefit quail. And then when we report back to the states each year what we've done, you've got some additional data that you can factor into your priority areas, which we'll get to in a minute. So what do we need? You provided a couple bullets that the NBCI would provide to NRCS. Information to the DCs about priority areas. You talked about the version 2.0 priority maps. That's great. And I think we can incorporate that very easily into working lands for wildlife. I'll show you how in a minute. And recommended conservation practices that would specifically benefit quail. We can do that. Scroll down to the next piece. Consider using Bobwhite priority areas. We can do that. That's very easy, especially where there's an overlap of the species that you've identified. Gopher tortoise and prairie chicken. Explicitly have NBCIs for additional ranking points. We can do that. That's not a problem. It's not a problem, but what we need from you guys is the data to convert our conservation practices to that outcome. I don't know how we get that. I don't know how we assemble that. My thinking is if it's not there for bobwhite quail with 70 or 80 years of research, we may not get there ever for these other species. So I think if we can't get this group to come together and figure out what we need to convert that data, that acreage of habitat, to some sort of a meaningful outcome for O&B purposes so we can keep the money coming, I don't know if we're going to be able to get to that point for any of the species. That's where we need your help to do that. So I think we can have some discussion about that maybe now. If you've got any questions or thoughts about that, there's a lot of difficulties. Every state research institution has come up with slightly different recommendations. How do we merge all those together for the gopher tortoise range, which goes from South Carolina all the way over to Mississippi? How do we merge those together and have some uniform recommendations or conversions? I don't have the answer to that, but I'm hoping that you can help us with that. Scroll down a little bit, see if you go to the next one. So I've highlighted the gopher tortoise. I think that's it. Can we go back to the PowerPoint? So I don't know the mechanism for how we get to that point. Maybe Don can help. I've talked with Kyle on a couple different occasions about how do we get to that point. Perhaps we can do it in the committees tomorrow to start the conversation to get there. I don't know, but I know that that's what we need from you in order for me to make a recommendation to the chief to have bobwhite quail as a secondary species. If we don't have that, what are we getting extra? We can't use that to justify the additional money that we're getting. So that's what I've put forth as what we need from y'all. Here's an example of some of the practices. I know it's small for those in the back. The practices that we put on the ground last year for the gopher tortoise. And you'll see it's a lot of the same practices that you would be doing directly for quail. You'll also notice that we did a lot of tree and shrub establishment. Predominantly, that's longleaf pine establishment. So 13,000 acres of longleaf pine went on the ground that are currently not being reported as longleaf pine acres. They're reported as gopher tortoise habitat. So there's some opportunities there where we can use some of our data that we already have to populate some of our goals for other species. So we need the data to convert our practice metrics to population response. We need an assessment of those practices. That list of practices that I just showed you, I need an assessment from you guys on which ones of those do you feel are targeted for quail. Obviously, a stock tank for cattle grazing is not directly tied to quail benefit, but the prescribed grazing system that goes with it is. And that's the kind of information that we need from y'all. The priority core area overlap. We've already identified the gopher tortoise range. We've identified the core area. Where do your hotspots overlap with that range? And in that hotspot, we can jack up the ranking points and make those applications go straight to the top. To me, that's prioritizing. That's putting money in a place where we recognize that we need it. That's easy for us to do. Sounds like you've got that system. It's almost ready. It's almost complete. I think we can merge those together pretty easily, probably by the next fiscal year, because we won't roll out our programs until December, January anyway, which is about when that should be complete. The last thought that I have for you is, where are the areas on the ground that are currently successful? Where do we have momentum on the ground? Even if it's Hopefully it's within those identified priority areas, but maybe in South Carolina, where it's a fairly new effort, maybe there's not those identified Bobwhite priority core areas, but there's a lot of momentum going on around, and we can target that area as well. So think about those things. I'm not sure the best mechanism to get some feedback, other than we've got 5 or 10 minutes right now. If we want to have some dialogue, have some discussion, I'm up for it. Otherwise, we can talk more in the committee meetings.